In April of 1750, there was unusual excitement around a log cabin on a pioneer farm in Pennsylvania. The Boone family was busy packing boxes and carrying them to the covered wagon in the yard. In the morning, they would be leaving for North Carolina to look for better farmland. Good land was getting scarce in Pennsylvania. There were 11 children in the Boone family. Mother said the boys will all be wanting farms. Daniel was going to be their guide. He was only 16 years old, but his father felt he knew more about the trails, wild animals, and Indians than any other hunter in those parts. At daybreak the next day, the Quaker neighbors came to say goodbye. They gave the Boone some extra salt and maple sugar to take with them. It was hard saying goodbye to their good neighbors. Mrs. Boone wished they were not leaving. The covered wagon, loaded with food, clothing, and cooking utensils, carried the younger children. Others walked or rode horseback. Daniel, gun in hand, led the way. As they waved goodbye for the last time, the Boone family began to look forward for their new homes and rich lands in North Carolina. Every night Daniel tried to find a good place to camp. He always looked for a spring of cool water. After camp was made, the boys gathered wood and built a fire. At times, there was deer meat or wild turkey roasted over the open fire. The trip from Pennsylvania to North Carolina was 500 miles. Today, such a trip would take about a day. For Daniel and his family, the trip took a year and a half. When they arrived in North Carolina, they settled down to farming. Daniel Boone soon learned that he was not a farmer. He liked hunting and trapping and spent most of his time in the forest.
Daniel Boone spent nearly 17 years hunting and trapping in North Carolina. One day a stranger came to the little settlement. His name was John Finley. He had just come back from a trip to the other side of the mountains. He had wonderful stories to tell. He said there was so much game you could shoot with your eyes closed. The soil is rich and the rivers are full of fish. Why don't you come and hunt with us, Daniel? Finley and Boone made plans for a trip to Kentucky. 4 other men wanted to go too. In the spring of 1769, the little party was ready to leave. It was hard saying goodbye to their wives. They were not sure if they'd ever see each other again. Each man took his gun, powder horn, and plenty of powder. They also took hunting knives and axes, for they would have to chop their way through the forest. They had to wear buckskins, for these could withstand the wear and tear of the underbrush. They met at Daniel Boone's cabin. He was chosen as their leader. Last-minute plans were made for the long trip. They couldn't afford to forget anything, for there were no stores along the trail. Little did Daniel Boone realize that as he said goodbye to his wife, he was about to begin an adventure that would be recorded in history books for all time. The hunters went through the mountains at the Cumberland Gap. This gap was an opening in the mountain wall. It was much easier to go through the gap than over the high mountain ridges. Sometimes the going was so rough that the men had to chop their way through the brush. For 5 weeks, Daniel and his friends traveled through the wilderness. Finally, they came upon a beautiful level region. Here they set to work to build a camp for themselves and to hunt. All summer and all fall they hunted and trapped. The piles of skins and furs grew higher and higher. Daniel had never seen such fine hunting. Daniel Boone remained in Kentucky for 2 years. In the spring of 1771, he went back to his home in North Carolina. He made up his mind to start a settlement in Kentucky. Daniel Boone's friends and neighbors never tired of hearing stories of Kentucky, but they thought it too dangerous a place to live. They didn't want to take their families where the Indians were so warlike. Daniel never gave up the idea of starting a settlement in Kentucky. By 1775, many people heard about Kentucky. They began to think as Daniel Boone, that Kentucky would be a good place in which to live. One day, a man came to visit Daniel Boone. He wanted to start a company to bring settlers to Kentucky. He asked Daniel Boone if he would cut a road through the forest and over the mountains and find a place for the first settlement. Daniel Boone and 30 men took the job. They began in Virginia with nothing but picks and axes. When they finished, it was not much of a road. It was really a trail for horses. This trail later became known as the Wilderness Road. For many years, the pioneers would be traveling over this road to find new homes in Kentucky. When Boone and his men reached the Kentucky River, they began to build cabins and a fort to protect themselves from the Indians. They put posts into the ground to make a high wall of logs all around the fort. One corner of the fort was near the river. This made it easy to get the water if they were attacked by the Indians. All the trees around the fort were cut down. If the Indians attacked, they would have to cross this open ground. They finished the fort in the spring of 1775 and named it Boonesboro after Daniel Boone. Some men were left to guard the fort, while Daniel Boone and the rest went back to get their families and more supplies. Mrs. Boone and her daughter were the first white women to come to the new settlement. At last, Daniel Boone's dream of starting a new settlement in Kentucky had come true.